Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into medieval times, a period where people woke up every morning, looked at their surroundings, and collectively agreed, yes, this is fine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In medieval times, death wasn't a distant concept or an uncomfortable topic politely avoided at dinner. Death was a neighbour, a very quiet neighbour, one that never moved out and occasionally resurfaced after heavy rain. Graveyards were not peaceful, fenced-off spaces meant for reflection and whispering. They were public zones, thoroughfares, social areas. If you were late for market, you cut through the cemetery. If you needed a place to meet someone privately, you met them between two graves. If you were a child looking for somewhere to play, congratulations. You were now playing tag among the deceased. And nobody thought this was odd. Burials were temporary arrangements at best. Space was limited, bodies were plentiful, and medieval soil did not respect personal boundaries. Coffins collapsed, rain eroded graves, bones slowly emerged like they had unfinished business. Finding a skull after a storm wasn't a horror movie moment, it was a maintenance issue. The medieval equivalent of seeing a pothole and thinking, someone should probably deal with that. People reacted accordingly. They nudged bones aside with their feet. They stacked them near church walls. They reburied them loosely, the way you might tidy up a blanket that slipped off the couch. No screaming, no fainting, just quiet acceptance and mild inconvenience. Churchyards doubled as meeting spaces. Business deals were discussed next to headstones. Arguments happened beside graves. Children ran around while adults negotiated prices for bread, all under the watchful gaze of several generations of skeletons who had absolutely seen worse. And somehow, this didn't make medieval people morbid. It made them practical. When death is everywhere, it stops being dramatic. It becomes part of the environment, like mud, church bells, or that one neighbour who always smells faintly of sheep. Imagine growing up learning to walk while carefully avoiding grave markers. Imagine being told not to kick the skull because that belongs to someone. Imagine stepping over a femur on your way to buy vegetables and thinking, again. To a medieval person, this wasn't creepy, it was convenient. Death wasn't hidden, feared, or denied. It was present, acknowledged, and quietly tolerated, like bad weather or an unpopular tax. And perhaps that's the creepiest thing of all, when something terrifying becomes so familiar that it barely registers anymore. At some point, medieval Europe ran into a problem that modern city planners would recognize immediately. There were simply too many dead people, and not enough space to put them. Graveyards filled up fast, because medieval life had a habit of ending suddenly and without much warning. When space ran out, medieval society did what it always did. It improvised, calmly, and with unsettling confidence. The solution was the ossuary. Instead of expanding cemeteries endlessly, old graves were dug up, and the skeletons were removed once the flesh had done everyone the courtesy of disappearing. These bones were not discarded. They were recycled, stacked, sorted, organized. Very neatly, in fact, because nothing says respect like good bone management. Skulls were arranged in rows, femurs were piled like firewood. Entire walls were built out of human remains. Chapels were decorated with them, ceilings supported by them. In some places, bones were arranged into patterns and symbols, just to show that, yes, this was intentional interior design. And people prayed there, not nervously, not quickly. They knelt, bowed their heads, and spoke softly, surrounded by thousands of empty eye sockets silently attending the service. This wasn't considered morbid. It was considered practical. Bones were reminders of mortality, sure, but they were also space-saving solutions. Medieval minimalism, the truly unsettling part, is how unbothered everyone was. Children grew up attending church in rooms literally made of ancestors. Travelers visited ossuaries the way we visit museums. Locals gave directions like, "Turn left at the skull wall." Nobody felt the need to explain themselves. If anything, ossuaries were comforting. They represented order. The dead weren't lost. They were organized, catalogued, watching politely from the walls. Death had a place, and that place had shelves. And of course, this wasn't hidden away. Ossuaries were often attached to churches in the center of town. You didn't stumble into them by accident. You walked in on purpose, nodded respectfully to the bones, and continued with your prayers. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Yes, this is where we worship. Yes, those are skulls. No, we don't find it strange. Please stop screaming. To medieval people, this wasn't creepy. It was efficient. When death is everywhere, you don't hide it. You stack it neatly and move on. If living next to graves and praying beside bone walls didn't convince you medieval life had a unique relationship with fear, allow me to introduce medieval medicine, a field built on confidence, tradition, and the bold assumption that less blood is always better than more blood. Bloodletting was the medieval cure for almost everything. Fever, bloodletting, headache, bloodletting, feeling tired, sad, anxious, or mildly inconvenienced by existence? Congratulations. It was time to remove some blood. Doctors believed the body was governed by humours, and illness came from imbalance. The solution was not rest, diet, or common sense. It was opening a vein and hoping for the best. And here's the fun part. Doctors weren't always the ones doing it. Barbers handled bloodletting. The same person who trimmed your beard and shaved your head could also decide today was a good day to drain you like a leaky barrel. This was not considered alarming. It was considered efficient. Why visit two professionals when one man with a blade could handle both hair and circulatory issues? The iconic red and white barber pole still exists today. And no, it is not decorative. The red represents blood. The white represents bandages. In other words, it's a centuries-old sign that says, haircuts available, veins optional. The process itself was quick and confident. A small cut, a bowl placed beneath, blood flowing freely while the practitioner nodded thoughtfully, as if watching the answer to life's problems drip out in real time. If you started to feel dizzy, that meant it was working. If you fainted, that meant it was really working. Bloodletting was scheduled too. Some people were bled regularly, even when healthy, just to stay balanced. Imagine booking a routine appointment to lose a portion of your vital fluids and walking out thinking, "Ah yes, much better." Of course, results varied. Some patients recovered, others became weaker, a few died. This was considered acceptable statistical noise. Medicine was still learning. The truly unsettling part isn't the practice itself, it's the faith people placed in it. Bloodletting wasn't questioned, it wasn't debated, it was trusted. Generations accepted it because it was normal, because respected authorities endorsed it, and because everyone else was doing it. To medieval people, bleeding wasn't dangerous, not bleeding was. And that quiet certainty that the path to health involved losing what keeps you alive might be the creepiest diagnosis of all. After medieval medicine decided that removing blood was a great idea, it naturally followed up with a second bold strategy: tasting bodily fluids. Because when you don't have microscopes, lab tests, or basic hygiene standards, the human senses become medical instruments, and not the good ones. Urine was the star of medieval diagnostics. Doctors believed it carried vital information about the body's internal state, and they were absolutely right about one thing: it did carry information. Unfortunately, their method of collecting that information was intimate. A patient would arrive carrying a flask of urine, usually still warm, which was considered a helpful detail rather than a warning sign. The doctor would hold it up to the light, swirl it gently, and study its color with deep concentration. Pale meant one thing, dark meant another, cloudy meant something else entirely. This part alone already looks unsettling to modern eyes, but medieval doctors were just getting started. Next came the smell test, a careful sniff, sometimes accompanied by a thoughtful nod. This was not a joke. Smell was a diagnostic category. A strong odor suggested imbalance. A weak odor suggested weakness. At no point did anyone say, "Perhaps we should stop inhaling this." And then, in some cases, came the taste. Yes, doctors occasionally sampled urine. A small sip, a dab on the tongue, a quick judgment. Sweetness could indicate disease. Bitterness could indicate something else. The medieval doctor stood there, tongue slightly out, considering your internal organs like a wine critic evaluating a questionable vintage. Notes of illness, a hint of doom. Very concerning. This was considered professional. Patients trusted it. Doctors trained for it. Medical texts discussed urine flavors seriously, with no sense of irony or regret. What makes this especially unsettling is how routine it was. No one fainted. No one protested. No one asked for gloves. Urine analysis wasn't fringe medicine. It was mainstream. If your doctor didn't inspect your urine, you'd probably wonder whether they were taking you seriously. And remember, these doctors often went from tasting urine to eating lunch without washing their hands, because germ theory was still several centuries away from politely knocking on the door of human knowledge. To medieval people, this wasn't disgusting. It was thorough. Health was something you inspected directly, personally, and sometimes with your mouth. And if that makes you uncomfortable, congratulations. You are thinking with modern standards. Medieval medicine didn't just cross boundaries. It never noticed they existed. Once medieval medicine had finished bleeding you and thoughtfully tasting your bodily fluids, it sometimes escalated to the final boss of healthcare: surgery. And if you're wondering whether medieval surgeons used anesthesia, sterilization, or pain management of any kind, the answer is a confident, historically documented no. Surgery was performed while fully awake, wide awake, painfully aware. If you were lucky, you were given alcohol. If you were unlucky, you were told to be brave. Either way, the plan was simple. Work fast and hope the patient didn't die, or stop screaming, which was often interpreted as the same thing. Speed mattered more than precision. A good medieval surgeon wasn't praised for neat stitches or clean technique. He was praised for finishing quickly. Amputations were timed. Records proudly mention limbs removed in under a minute, as if this were an Olympic sport instead of a medical emergency. And remember, this happened without understanding infection. Tools were not sterilized, hands were not washed. Surgeons moved directly from one patient to the next, sometimes still wearing yesterday's blood like a badge of experience. Germs were not feared. They were simply unknown, quietly enjoying themselves. Surgeons relied on assistants to hold patients down, strong men, relatives, sometimes multiple people. The screaming wasn't considered a problem. It was useful feedback. Screaming meant the patient was conscious. Conscious meant alive. Silence was concerning. After surgery, recovery was a gamble. Some people healed. Some developed infections so dramatic they were described in chronicles with alarming enthusiasm. If you survived, it was credited to skill, prayer, or divine mercy. If you didn't, it was fate, or God's will, or something you probably deserved, depending on the mood of the day. What makes this especially unsettling is how normal it all felt. People didn't panic at the idea of surgery. They dreaded it. Yes, but they accepted it. Pain was expected. Endurance was praised. Surviving agony was seen as a moral virtue, not a failure of medicine. And here's the quiet horror underneath it all. Medieval people didn't expect comfort from healthcare. They expected suffering. If treatment didn't hurt, they doubted it was doing anything. To them, pain wasn't a sign something was wrong. It was proof that something was being done. And that belief, that healing must hurt, lingered far longer than medieval times ever did. If medieval medicine taught people that pain was educational, medieval justice decided pain should also be public, instructional, and preferably scheduled for a convenient afternoon. Executions were not hidden away. They were advertised, announced, anticipated. In many towns, Execution Day was the closest thing to a community event. People planned around it. Crowds gathered early to secure a good view, the way you might arrive early for a parade. Vendors sold food and drinks. Children were brought along because this was considered a valuable life lesson. Parents pointed, explained, and occasionally covered eyes, not out of trauma, but because it was polite to pretend this was still a bit serious. Executions were meant to be seen. Justice only worked if it was visible. The suffering was the message. Hanging, beheading, burning. Each method carried symbolism, and spectators understood exactly what crime led to which ending. This wasn't chaos. It was a carefully curated warning system. And yes, people reacted emotionally. Sometimes they cheered. Sometimes they jeered. Sometimes they prayed. If an executioner did a poor job, and that happened more often than anyone would like, the crowd complained loudly. A clean execution was considered professional. A messy one meant the executioner might be pelted with food afterward. Medieval customer reviews were unforgiving. What makes this unsettling isn't just the violence, it's how normalized it was. People went from watching someone die to buying bread and heading home for dinner. There was no emotional decompression period. Death was a public service announcement, not a psychological event. Even criminals accepted this system. Condemned prisoners often confessed publicly, apologized to the crowd, and asked for prayers. It was part of the ritual. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew how the story ended. And perhaps the strangest part, executions were sometimes seen as morally uplifting. Watching justice carried out was thought to strengthen the community, remind people of right and wrong, and bring order to a dangerous world. Imagine explaining this to a modern audience. Yes, we bring snacks. Yes, we bring children. No, this does not traumatize them. It builds character. To medieval people, this wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Justice wasn't quiet. It wasn't hidden. It stood on a platform and made sure you were watching. At some point, medieval society looked at crime, justice, and responsibility, and decided animals should be held fully accountable too. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, legally. If a pig injured a child, the pig could be arrested. If rats destroyed crops, they could be summoned to court. Insects that ruined vineyards were sometimes formally accused. This was not satire. This was paperwork. Animals were brought before judges, assigned legal representation, and given sentences. Pigs were the most frequent defendants, largely because pigs were everywhere and had absolutely no respect for personal boundaries. If a pig attacked someone, it might be dressed in human clothing and executed publicly, because clearly the issue was moral failure, not the fact that pigs are pigs. And everyone took this seriously. Court records describe trials where lawyers argued on behalf of animals with complete professionalism. A defense attorney might argue that the rats failed to appear in court because the roads were unsafe, or because cats posed a legitimate threat to their safety. This was considered a strong legal argument. Sometimes animals were excommunicated. Yes, excommunicated. Priests issued formal curses ordering pests to leave the area or face spiritual consequences. The animals, unsurprisingly, rarely complied, but the ritual itself mattered. It restored order. It showed that authority had been asserted. What makes this particularly unsettling is how calm and logical it all seemed at the time. Medieval people believed the world was governed by moral rules that applied to everyone: humans, animals, and occasionally objects. If something caused harm, it must be judged. That's it. End of discussion. No one asked whether the pig understood the charges. No one worried about intent. Responsibility was universal. If something bad happened, someone, or something, had to be punished publicly so the universe could relax again. From a modern perspective, it's absurd. From a medieval one, it was comforting. The world made sense. Justice reached everywhere. Chaos was being managed. Imagine standing in a crowd watching a pig on trial and thinking, yes, this seems correct. Imagine explaining to your child that the pig is being punished because it knew better. To medieval people, this wasn't cruelty. It was order. The idea that animals might be above the law, that would have been truly unthinkable. In medieval times, sleep was not a private, sacred experience. It was a group activity, a practical arrangement, a mild social experiment conducted every single night. Entire families slept in one bed. Not just parents and children, sometimes grandparents too. Beds were expensive, space was limited, and warmth mattered more than personal boundaries. Body heat was a resource, and medieval people were very efficient with resources. If you had a bed to yourself, you were either wealthy, sick, or deeply suspicious. And it didn't stop with family. If you traveled and stayed at an inn, chances were high you'd be sharing a bed with a stranger, possibly multiple strangers. Gender separation was flexible. Privacy was a concept still in development. You climbed into bed, nodded politely to the person already there, and hoped they didn't snore, itch excessively, or try to tell you their life story at midnight. This was considered normal hospitality. Inns didn't advertise private rooms because that wasn't the expectation. They advertised a bed, singular. The bed was communal. Think of it less like a hotel and more like a medieval sleep lottery. You never knew who you'd wake up next to, assuming you woke up at all and weren't eaten alive by fleas during the night. And yes, fleas were present. Always. They lived in the bedding, the straw mattresses, the blankets, and occasionally on you. Scratching in bed wasn't rude, it was expected. If someone wasn't scratching, people assumed they were lying. Children grew up with this as their baseline. They learned early how to sleep without kicking, how to tolerate strangers' elbows, and how to accept that the warmth pressing against them might belong to someone they'd never met before and would never meet again. Even the wealthy weren't immune. Nobles slept in large chambers with servants nearby. Privacy was still limited. Someone was always watching, listening, or hovering with a candle. Solitude during sleep was rare and sometimes considered unsafe. The unsettling part isn't the closeness, it's the lack of discomfort about it. Medieval people didn't feel violated. They felt practical. Warmth mattered. Safety mattered. Personal space was negotiable. Imagine explaining modern sleep habits to a medieval person. Yes, I sleep alone. Yes, in my own room. Yes, the door is closed. They would look at you the way we look at haunted houses, with suspicion and mild concern. To medieval people, sleeping alone wasn't peaceful, it was strange. And crawling into bed beside a complete stranger, that was just good manners. When you live in a world without science as we understand it, you still need explanations. Medieval people had plenty. They just weren't comforting. Everything strange, frightening, or inconvenient had a cause, and that cause was almost never bad luck. It was demons, witches, spirits, or someone somewhere who had definitely angered God. Nightmares were not dreams, they were attacks. If you woke up sweating and terrified, that wasn't your subconscious working through stress. It was a demon testing your defenses. Sleep paralysis, in particular, was explained with impressive confidence. A witch, a spirit, or a malicious creature was believed to sit on your chest at night, crushing your breath while you lay helpless. This explanation was so widely accepted that artists painted it. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Mental illness didn't exist as a category. Strange behavior meant possession. Hearing voices meant something had moved in. Sudden personality changes meant something was trying to take control. The solution wasn't therapy or rest. It was prayer, fasting, and shouting at the problem until it left. If that failed, stronger measures followed, often involving restraints and a great deal of holy water. Illness itself was deeply moral. Getting sick wasn't just unfortunate. It suggested wrongdoing. Either you had sinned, someone else had sinned near you, or God was testing you in a way that felt suspiciously personal. Recovery meant forgiveness. Death meant lessons for everyone else. Even natural events were treated with suspicion. Sudden storms were omens. Failed crops were punishment. Birth defects were signs. Nothing happened without meaning. The universe was not random. It was judgmental, observant, and extremely invested in your daily behavior. The unsettling part isn't that medieval people believed these things. It's that the system worked, psychologically at least. Fear created order. Explanation created comfort. If something terrible happened, it wasn't chaos. It was intentional. Someone was in charge, even if that someone seemed cruel and unpredictable. And once you accept that framework, everything makes sense. You don't feel powerless. You feel watched, which, to medieval people, was better. Imagine trying to explain modern explanations to them. No, it's just your brain misfiring. They would stare at you, deeply concerned, and ask why your brain was allowed to do that unsupervised. To medieval people, superstition wasn't ignorance. It was structure. The world wasn't terrifying because it was unknown. It was terrifying because it was personal, and it was always paying attention. In medieval times, childbirth was not a quiet, private moment shared between a mother and a carefully trained medical team. It was a community event, loud, crowded, deeply stressful, and attended by people who were very confident despite having no real plan. Women gave birth at home, usually in their own bed, surrounded by midwives, neighbors, female relatives, and anyone else who felt vaguely qualified to offer advice. The room filled quickly, Doors closed, curtains drawn. Men were sent away, not because the situation was delicate, but because this was considered women's business, and also because screaming was involved. Everyone had an opinion. One woman prayed, another gave instructions, someone burned herbs, someone else blamed the mother for thinking an impure thought months earlier. It was less a medical procedure and more a live-action ritual fueled by anxiety, superstition, and hope. And here's the part medieval people quietly accepted. Survival was uncertain. Childbirth was dangerous. For the mother, for the child, for both. Everyone in the room knew this, which is why prayers were constant and emotional attachment was cautious. Celebrations often waited. Naming the child sometimes waited. Getting too excited too early was considered tempting fate. If something went wrong, it wasn't treated as a medical failure. It was God's will, or a test, or punishment, or something that would eventually make sense, even if it didn't feel comforting at the time. There was no rage at the system. There was resignation. The creepiest part is how routine this was. Women gave birth repeatedly, often while already exhausted, undernourished, and terrified. And then, if they survived, they got up and returned to daily life astonishingly quickly, because work didn't stop just because you'd narrowly avoided death. Midwives held enormous power. They weren't just medical helpers, they were spiritual figures. They baptized newborns in emergencies. They judged whether a birth was going well. Their words carried weight, and if something went wrong, they were sometimes blamed, or worse. Imagine explaining modern childbirth to a medieval woman. You'll be alone with professionals, you'll have pain relief, you'll probably survive. She would look at you like you were telling a fairy tale and ask which saint made that possible. To medieval people, childbirth wasn't beautiful. It was dangerous, and the fact that it happened so often made it no less terrifying. It was normal, and that's what makes it unsettling. Medieval people didn't just remember the dead, they kept pieces of them, and not in a subtle, tucked-away way, in a proud, well-lit, publicly displayed way. Relics were physical remains of saints. Fingers, teeth, ribs, skull fragments, drops of blood, and occasionally things that were allegedly drops of blood. These were housed in ornate containers made of gold, silver, and gemstones, because nothing elevates a severed finger quite like fine craftsmanship. Churches competed for relics, towns argued over them, pilgrims traveled vast distances just to see them. Owning a relic wasn't just spiritually important, it was economically valuable. More relics meant more pilgrims. More pilgrims meant more money. Holiness was good for business, and people didn't just look at relics. They kissed them, touched them, pressed them against their faces. Sometimes they were passed around like sacred souvenirs. This was not considered unhygienic, it was considered reverent. The truly unsettling part is that some saints had multiple skulls scattered across Europe, and nobody felt the need to address this inconsistency. If a church claimed to have the true skull of a saint, people believed them. If another church claimed the same thing a few hundred miles away, that was also accepted. Medieval logic was flexible when faith was involved. Relics were believed to heal illness, protect towns, and ward off disaster. If a city survived a plague, the relics got credit. If a battle was won, the relics had clearly helped. If nothing happened at all, that too was evidence of divine protection. And when relics didn't work, that was never their fault. The believer must not have been worthy, or perhaps the saint was busy, or testing you. Saints, like medieval customer service, were believed to operate on their own schedule. From a modern perspective, it's unsettling. Human remains displayed openly, crowds touching them daily. entire belief systems built around fragments of bone. But to medieval people, relics weren't creepy. They were comforting. They made the divine tangible. They brought heaven closer. They turned death into protection. Imagine explaining to a medieval pilgrim that touching a 1,000-year-old finger might spread disease. They would stare at you in horror, not at the hygiene issue, but at your lack of faith. To them, relics weren't morbid. They were miraculous. And once again, the strange becomes normal. Medieval people did not struggle with hygiene. That implies effort. The truth is simpler and far more unsettling. Medieval people had a completely different relationship with dirt, parasites, and personal cleanliness, one that involved quiet acceptance and a lot of scratching. Bathing was rare, not because people enjoyed being dirty, but because heating water took time, fuel, and effort that could be better spent not starving. Full-body baths were occasional events, sometimes seasonal, sometimes ceremonial, and sometimes avoided because too much bathing was thought to weaken the body by opening the pores and letting illness sneak in. Cleanliness, ironically, was considered dangerous. Instead, people washed selectively. Hands, face, maybe feet. Everything else was negotiable. As a result, lice were not a sign of neglect. They were a sign of being alive. Fleas lived in bedding, clothing, straw mattresses, and floor rushes. Everyone had them. Everyone scratched. Scratching openly was not rude. It was honest. If someone wasn't scratching, people assumed one of three things. They were lying, they were wealthy, or they were somehow unnatural. Fleas were such a constant presence that they barely registered as pests. They were background noise, like church bells or bad weather. Medieval humor even included flea jokes, which tells you how deeply accepted the situation was. When your jokes involve parasites, you've made peace with something. Clothing didn't help. Garments were worn constantly, rarely washed, and passed down through families. Wool trapped warmth and also trapped absolutely everything else. Fleas loved it. Lice considered it premium real estate. Changing clothes frequently wasn't a thing. Clothes were valuable, and washing them too often damaged the fabric. Beds were worse. Straw mattresses were replaced infrequently, and straw was an excellent hiding place for insects. Sleeping meant sharing warmth not just with other people, but with entire ecosystems that became active the moment the lights went out. The unsettling part isn't that medieval people lived like this. It's that they didn't feel especially dirty. This was normal. This was baseline. The human body adapted. Expectations adjusted. Complaints were minimal because there was nothing to compare it to. Imagine telling a medieval person, "In the future, people will bathe daily and still complain." They would look at you with genuine confusion and ask what everyone was apologizing for. To medieval people, dirt wasn't a failure, it was environment. And the idea of being completely clean all the time? That would have seemed deeply suspicious. In medieval times, fire was both your best friend and your most patient enemy. You needed it to cook, to stay warm, to see after sunset, and occasionally to keep wolves from feeling confident. But at the same time, it was quietly plotting to erase your entire town while you slept. Medieval cities were built to burn. Houses were packed tightly together, streets were narrow, and buildings were made of wood, thatch, and hope. Roofs were essentially dry grass waiting for inspiration. One stray spark could turn a neighborhood into a historical footnote by morning. And sparks were everywhere. Candles burned constantly. Hearths glowed all day. Cooking fires crackled indoors. Blacksmiths worked openly in town centers. There were no fire departments, no alarms. No organized response beyond everyone panic at once and throw water in roughly the correct direction. Fires happened often enough that people didn't react with shock. They reacted with resignation. Town records mentioned fires the way modern news mentions traffic delays. Yes, another one, very unfortunate. Several homes gone. Moving on. At night, families slept knowing that a single ember escaping the hearth could ignite the straw mattress beneath them. This wasn't paranoia. It was realistic risk assessment. People banked fires carefully, covered embers with ash, said a prayer, and hoped the house would still exist in the morning. Even churches weren't safe. Stone walls helped, but wooden roofs and interiors still burned. Entire cathedrals went up in flames more than once. When this happened, it wasn't seen as incompetence. It was destiny, or divine testing, or a reminder not to get too comfortable. The creepiest part is how accepted this danger was. People didn't demand safer buildings. They didn't redesign cities. They adapted emotionally. They learned to live with constant risk the same way they lived with plague, famine, and war. Imagine explaining modern fire codes to a medieval person. Yes, we don't allow open flames inside wooden homes anymore. They would stare at you and ask how you cooked dinner without angering the laws of physics. Fire was necessary. Fire was terrifying. Fire was unavoidable. And medieval people lived their entire lives balancing that contradiction, knowing that warmth and destruction came from the same glowing source, and trusting it anyway, which is perhaps the most medieval decision of all. In medieval society, violence wasn't shocking. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't something people whispered about. It was visible, expected, and woven directly into daily life like church bells or bad weather. Punishments were public by design. Whippings, mutilations, and executions happened where everyone could see them. Justice needed an audience. Pain was instructional. If someone broke the law, the community didn't just hear about it, they watched it happen in real time, and people brought their children. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was education. Parents believed witnessing punishment taught morality more effectively than words ever could. You didn't explain consequences, you displayed them, loudly. Beyond formal punishment, everyday life was rough. Fights broke out regularly. Drunken arguments ended with knives. Domestic violence was rarely hidden or punished. A certain level of physical conflict was simply assumed to be part of human interaction. If nobody was bleeding, the situation was considered manageable. War made this worse. Soldiers passed through towns frequently. Violence followed them like a shadow. Civilians expected it. There was no illusion of safety. Strength mattered. Reputation mattered. And fear was an accepted tool for maintaining order. Even children were exposed early. Corporal punishment was standard. Beatings were considered corrective, not abusive. A child who wasn't afraid of authority was thought to be poorly raised. Pain was believed to shape character. Mercy was admired in theory, but used sparingly in practice. The unsettling part isn't just how much violence there was, it's how emotionally normalized it became. People learned where to stand during punishments. They learned when to look and when not to. They developed rituals around violence that made it predictable and therefore tolerable. Imagine explaining modern sensibilities to a medieval person. Yes, we try to avoid physical punishment. They would look at you and ask how society functions without fear. To medieval people, violence wasn't chaos, it was structure. It drew boundaries, it enforced order, and it reminded everyone where they stood. The real horror isn't that medieval life was violent. It's that humans can grow accustomed to almost any level of brutality if it's consistent enough. After everything we've covered, the The bones, the blood, the public suffering, the parasites, the constant danger. You might expect medieval people to have lived in a permanent state of fear, curled up, trembling, waiting for the next disaster. But that's not what happened. They adapted. That is the creepiest part of all. Medieval people woke up every day surrounded by things that would horrify us, and they felt fine. Not happy, not thrilled, just normal. This was life. This was the world as it had always been, and as far as they knew, always would be. Death didn't shock them because it was familiar. Pain didn't surprise them because it was expected. Danger didn't paralyze them because it was constant. When something is everywhere, it stops being dramatic. It becomes background noise. A skull in the graveyard wasn't terrifying. It was a reminder to watch where you stepped. Bloodletting wasn't frightening. It was healthcare. Sharing a bed with strangers wasn't invasive. It was practical. Fleas weren't disgusting. They were roommates who refused to pay rent. Even violence lost its emotional edge. Public punishments weren't spectacles of horror. They were lessons. Order made visible. Fear made useful. People learned when to look, when to turn away, and when to nod solemnly and go back to their chores. This wasn't because medieval people lacked empathy or imagination. It was because humans are incredibly good at normalizing the environment they're given. We build routines around danger. We tell stories to explain suffering. We develop humor, dry, dark, and quiet, to make the unbearable manageable. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because every era has its own version of normal that future generations will find disturbing. Every age tolerates things it shouldn't because changing them feels impossible. Medieval people didn't see themselves as living in a nightmare. They saw themselves as living in reality, which raises an uncomfortable question. What are we living with right now that feels normal, but won't someday? That's the lingering chill medieval history leaves behind. Not the gore, not the fear, but the realization that humans can get used to almost anything, even horror. A medieval royal banquet was not a meal. It was a threat, politely served on silver. When a king or queen announced a feast, the purpose was never simply to feed guests. It was to remind everyone in the room who controlled land, labor, and life itself. Long before the first course arrived, the message had already landed. Look at how much I can afford to waste. The hall itself was part of the performance. Tapestries blazed with scenes of conquest. Fires roared in hearths large enough to swallow a modern living room. Hundreds of candles turned gold thread and polished armor into a shimmering reminder that this household did not worry about fuel shortages. Even the air smelled expensive. Smoke from roasting meat, sweet spices imported from faraway ports, and fresh bread made from refined white flour filled the space. Nothing here was accidental. The food came in waves, not courses. Roasted boar with apples, swans stitched back into their own feathers, rivers of gravy poured over trenches of bread that would be thrown away afterward. This wasn't indulgence, it was intimidation through abundance. Many guests had travelled days from estates where peasants survived on porridge and onions. Watching entire animals carved and discarded after a few bites was a sharp lesson in hierarchy. But the real weapon wasn't the food itself, it was who got what. The closer you sat to the ruler, the hotter your food arrived. Lesser nobles received colder dishes, tougher cuts, and fewer servants hovering at their elbows. The lowest-ranking guests were fed last, if at all, and were expected to be grateful for it. Seating charts were studied like battlefield maps, because one place higher or lower could signal favor, disgrace, or an approaching downfall. Conversation was carefully controlled too. Toasts praised the ruler's generosity, even as everyone understood the unspoken rule. This generosity could vanish overnight. To eat well at a royal table was to acknowledge dependence. Every bite carried a reminder that loyalty was rewarded, disobedience punished, and that power, like the banquet, flowed from the head of the table outward. In medieval courts, food was never neutral. It was a language. And at a royal banquet, it spoke fluently in dominance. If medieval royal banquets had a mascot, it would have been the peacock. Not because it tasted good, quite the opposite. Peacock meat was notoriously tough, dry, and unimpressive, which is exactly why it appeared so often on royal tables. This was not food meant to be enjoyed. It was food meant to be seen. The peacock arrived cooked, then resurrected. After roasting, servants carefully slid the bird's skin and feathers back over the carcass, reattaching the head and arranging the tail into a full, dazzling fan. Sometimes the beak was gilded. Sometimes the eyes were replaced with gemstones. Occasionally, the bird was made to breathe fire using hidden alcohol-soaked wicks. When it was carried into the hall, conversations stopped. The point was spectacle, not dinner. Serving peacock was an announcement. I can afford to serve something so impractical that no one actually wants it. Only a ruler with absurd resources would waste time, labor, and ingredients on a dish that existed purely to impress. It required skilled cooks, patient handlers, and hunters with exclusive rights. In other words, layers of privilege stacked neatly on a platter. Swans played a similar role. Like peacocks, they were often legally protected birds, reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Eating one was less about hunger and more about entitlement. When a swan appeared on the table, guests were being reminded that even nature itself was ranked. Some people ate barley, others ate birds that technically belonged to the crown. These animals were often presented whole, untouched, as if daring someone to carve them. And that was another test. Cutting into a ceremonial bird required confidence and rank. Hesitate, and you looked inexperienced. Cut poorly, and you embarrassed yourself in front of everyone who mattered. Even the act of slicing meat became a social performance. Of course, much of this food went uneaten. Servants hauled away plates barely touched, while peasants outside the castle walls survived on bread and ale. That contrast was not lost on anyone inside the hall. Waste was not a flaw of the banquet system. It was a feature. To modernize, serving decorative birds at dinner looks absurd. To medieval elites, it was perfectly logical. Power was about visibility. The louder, brighter, and more excessive the display, the harder it was to question who sat at the top. At a royal banquet, the peacock wasn't dinner. It was propaganda with feathers. If roasted peacocks were the opening act, sugar sculptures were the grand illusion. In the medieval world, sugar was not a casual ingredient. It was expensive, imported, and treated more like a luxury spice than a sweetener. Most people would never taste it in their lifetime. So when entire sculptures made of sugar appeared at a royal banquet, the message was unmistakable. This household bends global trade to its will. These creations, known as subtleties, were not desserts in the modern sense. They were edible statues, engineered by specialists who understood sugar like alchemists. Heated, poured, molded, painted, and reinforced, sugar could become castles, saints, ships, dragons, or coats of arms. Some subtleties recreated famous battles. Others depicted the ruler seated on a throne, calmly dominating their enemies in confectionery form. It was subtle only in name. Placed between courses, these sculptures acted as pauses in the meal. Guests didn't eat them right away. They stared, admired, applauded. Sugar was dyed in vivid colors, often brighter than anything else in the room. Gold leaf was sometimes added, because if you are already eating imported sweetness, you might as well eat actual gold too. The symbolism was layered. Sugar came from far-off plantations and trade routes, often passing through multiple kingdoms before reaching the table. Displaying it in excess was proof of international reach and financial muscle. Turning it into art showed control not just over resources, but over time and expertise. Skilled sugar workers were rare and expensive. Hiring them was a political choice. Eventually, the sculptures were broken apart and distributed, usually starting with the most important guests. This was not generosity. It was ritualized favoritism. Receiving a piece of sugar sculpture was a reminder of one's place in the hierarchy. Some guests ate their portion carefully, as if afraid to waste a single grain. Others barely touched it, knowing they could afford not to care. And once again, the irony was obvious. Outside the palace, sugar was medicine, if it existed at all. Inside, it was molded into disposable monuments. Entire artworks were consumed, shattered, or swept away before the next course arrived. In medieval royal banquets, sugar was never about sweetness. It was about scarcity, distance, and control. These sculptures didn't exist to satisfy hunger. They existed to prove that the ruler could afford to turn the rarest substance in Europe into something temporary. Edible power tastes better when it disappears. A medieval royal banquet was designed to wear you down. This was not an accident. Courses kept coming long after hunger had disappeared, replaced by discomfort, fatigue, and quiet desperation. The sheer length of the meal was part of the power play. If the ruler could afford to eat for hours, everyone else was expected to endure it. There was no neat progression from appetizer to dessert. Food arrived in overwhelming waves. Meat followed meat. Fish appeared after game. Sweet dishes interrupted savory ones with no warning. Just as guests thought the feast might be ending, another procession of platters entered the hall. The point was excess so extreme that restraint became impossible. This endless flow served a psychological purpose. Tired guests made mistakes. Overfed guests became sluggish, sloppy, and less guarded. Wine and ale flowed freely, loosening tongues and dulling caution. A long banquet was a perfect setting for extracting information, observing rival behavior, and watching who lost composure under pressure. Power did not just sit at the head of the table. It watched. There was also an element of forced participation. Leaving early could be interpreted as insult. Refusing food looked suspicious. Eating too eagerly suggested insecurity. Even digestion became political. A successful courtier mastered the art of appearing impressed without appearing desperate, full without appearing weak, grateful without appearing dependent. Servants reinforced this endurance test. Plates were cleared quickly, often before guests were finished, signaling that hesitation would not be accommodated. The next dish arrived whether you wanted it or not. Napkins grew greasy. Hands grew sore from cutting dense meat. The body's limits were quietly tested alongside loyalty. And then there was the contrast. While nobles struggled through course after course, entire meals were discarded untouched. Trenchers soaked with gravy were thrown away or given to servants. Bones piled high. Waste accumulated deliberately. A visible reminder that abundance here had no ceiling. By the time the later courses arrived, conversation dulled. Jaws ached. Stomachs protested. This was when political seating mattered most. Those closest to the ruler received lighter, finer dishes and better wine. Those farther away faced heavier food and fewer servants. Even discomfort was distributed by rank. In modern terms, a medieval royal banquet was a marathon with no finish line. Surviving it gracefully required training, discipline, and a strong understanding of court politics. Collapse was not physical alone. It was reputational. The feast did not end when the food stopped. It ended when the ruler decided everyone had endured enough. At a medieval royal banquet, the most important document in the room was not a treaty or a proclamation. It was the seating plan. Where you sat mattered more than what you ate, and everyone knew it. A single chair placed a few feet closer or farther from the ruler could announce favor, warning, or quiet disgrace without a word being spoken. The head table was sacred space. The ruler sat at the center, flanked by those deemed most valuable at that moment. This was not always the highest-ranking nobles. It was the most useful ones. A powerful ally, a recently forgiven rival, or a visiting ambassador might suddenly find themselves promoted to a seat of honor. Everyone noticed. Everyone took notes. Distance was symbolic. The closer you were to the ruler, the more visible you became. You were seen eating, speaking, laughing. This visibility signaled trust. Those placed farther away faded into the crowd, physically and politically. At the far end of the hall, guests were technically present, but functionally irrelevant. Their food arrived late, cold, or already picked over. Their conversations went unheard. Seating also controlled who interacted with whom. Rivals could be separated. Potential allies placed side by side. A troublesome noble might be wedged between dull companions to limit conversation. These arrangements were intentional and often cruel in their precision. No one needed to announce who was rising or falling. The furniture did the talking. Even the angle of the chair mattered. Being placed sideways to the ruler reduced eye contact. Sitting with your back partially turned suggested exclusion. Sitting directly across could be read as confrontation or challenge. Guests learned to interpret these nuances the way modern people read emails for tone. Moving during the banquet was dangerous. Standing uninvited or swapping seats risked offense. Even asking to change places could imply dissatisfaction, which courts never tolerated. You sat where you were placed and made the best of it. Of course, everyone pretended not to care. Offended nobles smiled tightly. Favored guests acted modest. But beneath the surface, seating decisions were dissected and remembered long after the dishes were cleared. A royal banquet did not require insults shouted across the table. It relied on quieter humiliations. Chairs were assigned. Messages were sent. Reputations shifted. In medieval courts, power rarely raised its voice. It simply rearranged the furniture. At a medieval royal banquet, eating was a performance, and everyone was being judged. There were rules for everything: how to sit, how to cut meat, how to wipe your hands, and even how quickly you were allowed to chew. Breaking these rules did not just make you look uncultured. It marked you as dangerous, unreliable, or unworthy of trust. Forks were rare and often viewed with suspicion. Most guests ate with knives, spoons, and their hands. This made table manners even more visible. Hands had to be clean, movements controlled. Reaching too far across the table, licking fingers, or dropping food onto your clothes signaled poor breeding. And poor breeding, in court logic, suggested poor judgment everywhere else. Carving meat was especially risky. Large joints arrived intact, demanding skill and confidence. Hesitation implied weakness. Overconfidence risked hacking the meat apart like a battlefield casualty. Ideally, carving was smooth, economical, and generous to those of higher rank. Serving yourself too much was greedy. Serving yourself too little suggested insecurity. There was a narrow path between those extremes, and everyone was expected to walk it gracefully. Napkins existed, but they were often shared or used to wipe hands rather than mouths. Tablecloths absorbed grease, wine, and occasional blood from careless cuts. Spills happened. What mattered was how you reacted. Panic drew attention. Calm recovery suggested experience. A guest who laughed lightly at a mishap often fared better than one who froze. Silence was also part of etiquette. Speaking with a full mouth, interrupting a superior, or raising one's voice too loudly could be remembered long after the banquet ended. Some courtiers cultivated the skill of appearing engaged without actually saying anything of substance. At court, silence was sometimes safer than wit. Then there were the tests. Dishes unfamiliar to certain regions appeared deliberately. A guest might be served something they did not recognize and be expected to eat it without comment. Refusal looked ungrateful. Curiosity looked naive. The correct response was acceptance without enthusiasm, a polite nod to the ruler's generosity. Failure was public. There were no private corrections. Mistakes unfolded in full view of rivals, allies, and servants who would repeat the story. One awkward moment could undo years of careful positioning. At a royal banquet, no one was simply eating. They were auditioning. And the knives on the table were not the sharpest things in the room. While guests struggled with food, seating, and etiquette, another layer of the banquet unfolded around them. Music played almost constantly. Minstrels, pipers, drummers, and singers filled the hall with sound, not purely for entertainment, but for management. Noise softened tension, masked private conversations, and kept attention where the ruler wanted it. Performers were carefully chosen. Their songs praised lineage, victories, and divine favor. Even comedic acts were calibrated. Jesters mocked safe targets, foreign enemies, peasants, or long-dead rivals. Laughing at the wrong joke could be dangerous. Failing to laugh could be worse. Humor at court was not spontaneous. It was choreographed. Dances and theatrical displays served a similar function. Allegorical performances depicted the ruler as justice, peace, or wisdom personified. Guests were not expected to analyze the symbolism. They were expected to absorb it. Repetition made the message feel natural. If you watched the king portrayed as God's chosen protector often enough, eventually it stopped feeling like propaganda. These distractions also prevented focus. A guest distracted by music was less likely to notice who whispered to whom, or how servants subtly altered service patterns throughout the hall. The constant movement and sound created a sense of controlled chaos. Important interactions happened in brief windows between performances, where only the most experienced courtiers knew how to take advantage. Entertainment also created emotional fatigue. After hours of eating, drinking, listening, and watching, guests became mentally dulled. Decisions made late in the evening were often impulsive. Promises slipped out. Reactions slowed. This was when rulers observed most closely. Even applause was managed. Certain performances demanded enthusiastic response, and courtiers learned to watch the ruler's face before clapping. Applauding too early or too late marked you as out of sync with power. Perfect timing signaled alignment. Performers themselves were tools. Minstrels overheard conversations. Jesters repeated gossip, disguised as jokes. Musicians doubled as messengers. The banquet hall was loud, but it was never uncontrolled. To the untrained eye, medieval royal banquets looked festive, even joyful. In reality, entertainment was another method of domination. It filled space, guided emotion, and drained resistance. By the time the final performances ended, guests were full, tired, and pliable, which was exactly the point. By the end of a medieval royal banquet, the tables looked like a battlefield. Bones stacked high, platters half-touched, sauces congealed in abandoned bowls. An astonishing amount of food remained uneaten, and that was not a logistical failure. It was part of the design. What happened next mattered almost as much as what had been served. Officially, leftovers became charity. Bread trenchers soaked in gravy were collected. Meat scraps were gathered. Wine dregs were poured into shared containers. This food was distributed to servants, guards, and sometimes the poor gathered outside the palace gates. On paper, this looked like generosity. In practice, it was carefully staged mercy. The ruler's household decided who received what. Favored servants were rewarded with better portions. Lesser staff received whatever remained. The poor, if included at all, were fed publicly, reinforcing the image of a benevolent ruler whose excess spilled outward. Hunger was not solved. It was managed just enough to maintain gratitude. This distribution was often ceremonial. Alms were given at specific times, sometimes accompanied by prayers or announcements. Witnesses mattered. Mercy performed in private earned no political credit. Mercy performed in public reinforced hierarchy. The message was clear. Survival flowed downward from the throne. There was also a darker layer. Leftovers reminded everyone how disposable abundance was at court. Food that could have sustained families for days had been used for spectacle, then casually discarded. The poor were not invited to question this imbalance. They were expected to be thankful for what remained. Even among nobles, leftovers carried meaning. Taking food away discreetly could suggest neediness. Refusing leftovers entirely signaled wealth and confidence. Once again, the correct behavior depended on rank, reputation, and timing. Meanwhile, the physical mess served as proof of success. A banquet that ended with clean tables had failed. Waste was the visual evidence that excess had been achieved. The more dramatic the aftermath, the stronger the ruler appeared. In modern terms, we might call this obscene. In medieval logic, it was order. Scarcity below justified abundance above. Charity softened resentment just enough to keep the system intact. When the hall finally emptied and servants began the long work of cleaning, the banquet's final lesson remained. Power did not need to consume everything it controlled. It only needed to show that it could. The medieval royal banquet did not end with the last dish. It ended when power had finished observing. By the time guests pushed back their chairs and the musicians fell silent, alliances had been tested, egos bruised, and loyalties quietly measured. The feast was the stage. The aftermath was where consequences unfolded. Deals were rarely signed at the table itself. That would have been crude. Instead, the banquet softened resistance. Wine loosened restraint. Exhaustion lowered defenses. Promises made in private chambers afterward felt natural, almost inevitable. A noble who had just been honored with good seating and generous service was more inclined to agree. One who had been sidelined was more likely to comply out of fear. Rulers remembered everything. Who laughed at the right moments, who handled discomfort with grace, who drank too much, who spoke too freely. A single banquet could reshape a court's balance of power for months. Invitations issued or withheld after the feast signaled who remained trusted and who had begun to fall. Foreign envoys understood this well. Banquets were diplomatic minefields. Being impressed was expected, but being intimidated was the real goal. leaving the hall convinced of the ruler's strength was more valuable than any written treaty. Food crossed language barriers. Excess required no translation. Even absence mattered. Not being invited was often worse than being seated poorly. It meant exclusion from observation, from influence, from relevance. A courtier who missed too many banquets did not last long. In the days following a feast, rumours spread faster than proclamations. Servants talked, musicians repeated stories, seating arrangements were dissected, small moments grew in importance. A misplaced smile or an overlooked greeting could be exaggerated into proof of favour or disgrace. To modernise, medieval royal banquets look theatrical, wasteful, even ridiculous. But they worked. They reinforced hierarchy without open violence. They rewarded loyalty without written contracts. They punished dissent quietly, efficiently, and in full view of everyone who mattered. Food was never the point. Power was. A royal banquet was a reminder that in the medieval world, authority did not always march in armour. Sometimes it arrived on a silver platter, smiling, offering you a seat, and watching carefully as you ate. For most empires, distance was a slow poison. Orders travelled at the speed of tired horses, unreliable messengers, and bad roads. By the time a ruler's command reached a distant province, the situation had usually changed, often catastrophically. Rebellions succeeded simply because news arrived too late. Generals lost wars not on the battlefield, but somewhere between dispatch and delivery. Delay was normal. Delay was expected. The Mongols refused to accept this. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched across continents, from the forests of Eastern Europe to the plains of East Asia. No previous empire had controlled so much land so quickly. And yet speed created a new problem. How do you rule a territory that vast without losing control the moment you turn your back? The answer was not more armies, it was information. For the Mongols, communication was as vital as cavalry. A Khan who could not send orders swiftly was a Khan who ruled in name only. The empire needed a system that ignored geography, weather, and exhaustion. A system where messages did not crawl, but flew. This was not an abstract concern. Mongol rule depended on constant coordination. Military units were spread across thousands of miles. Governors required updates. Intelligence about enemies, revolts, and resources had to move faster than rumors. Waiting weeks for news was unacceptable when campaigns could be decided in days. Most societies treated messengers as expendable. The Mongols treated them as strategic assets. If a rider collapsed from exhaustion, the system had failed. If a horse broke down, the empire slowed. That kind of weakness was intolerable. What emerged was a radical solution. A permanent, empire-wide relay network designed for speed above all else. Not improvised, not occasional, constant, maintained even in peacetime, because waiting to build it during crisis would already be too late. This network would allow a message to cross distances that normally took months in a matter of days. Riders would never need to stop for rest. Horses would always be waiting. Food, shelter, and authority were built directly into the system. The Mongols understood something most empires learned too late. Power is not just about conquering territory. It is about moving decisions faster than chaos can react. And that required defeating the oldest enemy of all, distance itself. The Mongol solution to distance was not a single road or a handful of messengers. It was an entire system, engineered to function without pause. This system was called the Yam, a vast relay network that stretched across the empire like a second circulatory system, carrying information instead of blood. Along major routes, relay stations were placed at regular intervals, often every few miles. Each station was stocked with fresh horses, food, water, and shelter. When a rider arrived, they did not rest. They dismounted, handed over the message, and a new rider immediately took over. The document kept moving, even as the messenger collapsed behind it. Speed mattered more than individual endurance. These stations were not optional or improvised. They were state infrastructure. Local communities were required to maintain them, supply animals, and feed travelers authorized to use the system. Failure to do so was treated as defiance of imperial authority. The YAM worked because everyone understood the cost of slowing it down. Riders carried official passes that granted them access to the network. With this pass, they could demand horses, food, and shelter without payment. Abuse of the system was punished severely, but within its rules the rider was untouchable. Even local officials were expected to step aside. The effect was astonishing. A single message could travel distances that normally took weeks in a fraction of the time. Riders moved day and night. Weather was an obstacle, not an excuse. Snow, rain, and darkness slowed horses, not orders. This constant motion created a new rhythm of governance. Information flowed faster than resistance could organize. Reports from distant frontiers arrived while decisions were still relevant. Commands returned before situations spiraled out of control. The YAM also allowed for redundancy. If one route failed, others compensated. If a station was damaged or compromised, neighboring stations absorbed the load. The system was resilient precisely because it was boringly consistent. There were no ceremonies, no monuments, just horses, roads, and men who rode until their role ended. Then someone else took over. For the Mongols, this was the point. The empire did not rely on heroic messengers or lucky timing. It relied on infrastructure that functioned whether anyone noticed or not. The YAM never slept, because the empire could not afford to. The YAM postal system was fast because its horses were not treated like heroes. They were treated like tools. Exceptionally good tools, carefully chosen and relentlessly managed, but never sentimentalized. The Mongols understood something most settled societies did not. Speed does not come from pushing one horse to its limits. It comes from never needing to. Mongol horses were small, sturdy, and unremarkable by the standards of medieval war horses. They were not bred for height or elegance. They were bred for endurance, hardiness, and an almost irritating ability to survive on very little. These animals could graze on sparse grass, endure extreme cold, and keep moving long after larger horses failed. That made them perfect for relay work. At YAM stations, fresh mounts waited at all times. Riders did not grow attached. A horse carried a message for a short stretch, then was replaced without ceremony. The system assumed exhaustion and planned around it. Horses rested, recovered, and were rotated back into service. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was rushed beyond its breaking point. This approach stood in sharp contrast to European courier systems, where a single horse might be pushed for miles until it collapsed. The Mongols saw that as inefficient. A dead horse was not a symbol of dedication. It was a logistical mistake. Breeding was tightly controlled. Herds near relay routes were reserved specifically for YAM use. These horses were trained to respond quickly to unfamiliar riders and sudden departures. Calm mattered more than obedience. A nervous horse slowed everything down. Riders, too, adapted to this reality. They traveled light. No armor, minimal gear, just the message, the pass, and enough awareness to stay alive. Their job was not to fight or impress. It was to move paper faster than anyone thought possible. The result was consistency. The YAM did not rely on bursts of speed followed by collapse. It relied on steady, relentless motion. Horses arrived tired but alive, riders dismounted without drama. The message never stopped. In many ways, the horses were the true backbone of the system. Without their durability, the relay would have failed. Without the discipline to protect them from overuse, speed would have been an illusion. The Mongols did not worship their horses, they respected them. And that respect turned animal endurance into imperial velocity. A Yam courier was not just a messenger, he was the empire in motion. When he rode into a settlement, carrying his official pass, local rules stopped applying. Gates opened, horses were surrendered, food appeared. The rider did not ask. He announced. This authority came from a system of credentials, often metal or wooden tablets issued by the Khan or high officials. These passes identified the courier as legitimate and untouchable. To interfere with a Yam rider was to interfere with imperial command itself. Punishments for obstruction were severe and immediate. The rider's authority mattered because the Yam depended on cooperation across thousands of miles. Local leaders might resent the burden. Supplying horses and food was expensive, but refusal was not an option. The courier's presence reminded everyone that the empire was not distant. It was already here. Riders moved fast and traveled alone or in small groups. They carried no valuables, no personal letters, and no unnecessary baggage. Everything about their role emphasized function over status. Their power came not from rank, but from what they carried. Immunity was practical, not ceremonial. A courier could pass through territories where armies were not welcome. He could cross borders, enter cities, and bypass checkpoints. His safety was assumed, because harming him meant retaliation far beyond the local scale. This did not make riders reckless. Speed required discipline. They avoided conflict. They did not linger. They did not argue. Their goal was arrival, not dominance. The authority they carried existed to remove friction, not to provoke it. Even so, abuse happened. Some officials attempted to exploit the system for personal errands or luxury travel. The Mongols responded brutally. Unauthorized use of the Yam undermined speed and trust. Offenders were punished publicly to reinforce that the network served the state, not individuals. The result was a rare balance. Couriers were powerful but constrained. They could demand resources, but only for movement. Anything else was theft from the empire. To stop a Yam rider was to slow information. To slow information was to invite chaos. The Mongols understood this chain clearly, and they enforced it without hesitation. Where the rider went, the empire followed, and it followed at full speed. The Yam was not just a postal system, it was an information net, and the Mongols used it to see their empire in near real time. Every message carried more than orders. It carried awareness. Reports flowed constantly. Troop movements, weather conditions, harvest yields, rumors of unrest. The Yam turned scattered observations into centralized knowledge. Couriers themselves were not spies, but the system they moved through was quietly observant. Relay station keepers noticed patterns. Which riders passed more often? Which routes grew busy? Which areas suddenly went quiet? That information traveled alongside official correspondence, sometimes faster than the messages it supported. Local officials were required to submit regular reports using the Yam. Silence was suspicious. A missing update suggested rebellion, incompetence, or disaster. Because the system moved so quickly, excuses rarely worked. Delays stood out immediately. This created a powerful psychological effect. Governors knew they were being watched, not by soldiers, but by time itself. Any disruption in communication triggered attention. The empire did not need to constantly inspect its provinces. It listened to them instead. Foreign intelligence flowed through the Yam as well. Envoys reported on rival courts. Merchants carried observations. Interpreters translated intercepted messages. The network absorbed it all. Information moved inward, was processed, and then moved outward again as orders. The speed of this loop mattered. By the time an enemy realized they were being observed, the Mongols were already responding. Rebellions were crushed before they matured. Alliances shifted before rivals could adapt. The Yam compressed decision cycles to a scale other empires could not match. Even secrecy was affected. Whispered plots depended on time and isolation. The Yam reduced both. News traveled faster than trust. By the time conspirators felt safe, reports were already in motion. This constant flow made the empire feel omnipresent. Even in distant regions, the Khan's awareness felt close. Not because soldiers stood everywhere, but because messages did. The Yam did not spy in the modern sense. It did something more unsettling. It made the absence of information louder than its presence. In a world where most rulers learned too late, the Mongols learned early, and they learned everything. The Yam looked effortless from the outside. Messages arrived quickly. Riders appeared and vanished. Orders flowed. But behind that smooth motion was a massive ongoing expense. Speed had to be fed, housed, and maintained every single day. Conquest was dramatic. Logistics were relentless. Each relay station required land, buildings, fodder, grain, meat, and fresh water. Horses needed rest and rotation. Riders needed shelter, even if only briefly. Someone had to breed the animals, repair tack, and keep routes passable through snow, mud, and heat. None of this happened automatically. The burden fell largely on local populations. Communities near relay routes were obligated to supply resources, often without direct compensation. This created resentment. Maintaining the Yam was not optional, and failure was punished. In effect, speed was taxed. The Mongols understood this risk. Too much pressure could destabilize the very regions the Yam relied on. To manage it, they standardized expectations. Routes were fixed, station distances were regulated, quotas were set. Predictability reduced chaos, even if it did not remove hardship. Importantly, the Yam was not restricted to wartime. It operated continuously, even during peace. This was expensive, but deliberate. Building speed only when needed meant reacting too late. Constant readiness kept the empire synchronized. There were attempts to economize. Certain routes were prioritized. Lesser stations were downgraded. Unauthorized riders were cut off. Efficiency mattered, but never at the expense of response time. This focus on infrastructure set the Mongols apart. Many empires invested heavily in monuments and courts. The Mongols invested in movement. Roads mattered more than palaces. Relay stations mattered more than walls. The cost was high, but the return was higher. Faster communication meant fewer rebellions, quicker mobilization, and more effective governance. The Yam paid for itself by preventing chaos before it became expensive. To the Mongols, speed was not a luxury, it was a form of stability. And stability, like speed, had to be maintained daily, or it disappeared. Although the Yam was built for imperial business, it never stayed exclusive for long. Merchants, diplomats, and foreign envoys soon learned that the fastest way across Eurasia was not by chance or luck, but by permission. With the right authorization, the Yam became the backbone of long-distance travel and trade. For merchants, this changed everything. Goods still moved slowly, but information moved fast. Prices, demand, political stability, and danger zones could be reported ahead of caravans. A trader who knew which cities were safe weeks in advance had an enormous advantage. The Yam turned commerce from a gamble into a calculated risk. Diplomats benefited even more. Envoys could cross hostile territory under imperial protection, moving faster than rumors or retaliation. Negotiations no longer depended on seasons alone. Messages went back and forth in days rather than months. This allowed the Mongols to coordinate alliances, intimidate rivals, and respond before diplomatic situations hardened into conflict. The system also encouraged movement. Scholars, craftsmen, and administrators traveled more easily within the empire. Ideas moved with them. Techniques, languages, and knowledge spread along the same routes as official messages. The Yam unintentionally accelerated cultural exchange on a scale unseen before. Of course, access was controlled. Unauthorized use was forbidden. Passes were checked. Station keepers were accountable. But even limited access created ripples. The empire became more connected internally than any previous state, foreign observers noticed. Travelers from Europe described a world where letters outran expectations, and authority felt immediate even at great distances. To them, the Mongol Empire felt strangely modern, not because it was gentle, but because it functioned. This connectivity supported what later historians would call a period of relative stability across much of Eurasia. Trade routes flourished, not because violence disappeared, but because information reduced uncertainty. Knowing what lay ahead mattered more than optimism. The Yam did not just serve the empire, it reshaped how people moved through it. Roads became predictable, time became reliable, distance shrank. In doing so, the Mongols achieved something rare. They made speed contagious. Once people experienced it, they organized their lives around it. The Yam worked because it was disciplined. And like all disciplined systems, it began to fail the moment that discipline weakened. As the Mongol Empire expanded and fractured into successor states, the relay network came under increasing strain. Speed remained impressive, but it was no longer clean. Abuse crept in first. Officials who were not entitled to Yam access began using it anyway. Personal errands, luxury travel, and unofficial messages clogged routes meant for urgent state business. Each misuse slowed the system slightly, but cumulatively, the effect was noticeable. When everything claims priority, nothing truly moves fast. Then came overload. The empire's own success created demand. More provinces meant more reports. More trade meant more requests. More diplomacy meant more messages. The Yam had been built for speed, not infinite volume. Relay stations struggled to keep up. Horses tired faster. Supplies ran thin. Maintenance slipped. Local resentment grew sharper. Communities forced to support stations year after year began resisting quietly. Horses disappeared. Fodder ran short. Station keepers delayed replacements. None of this stopped the Yam outright, but it introduced friction. And friction was the enemy. Political fragmentation worsened the problem. As centralized authority weakened, enforcement became uneven. Some regions maintained the network rigorously. Others treated it as optional. The Yam had depended on uniform obedience. Without it, speed became inconsistent. Ironically, the system's reputation lingered even as performance declined. Orders were still expected to arrive quickly. When they didn't, confusion followed. Commanders acted independently. Governors delayed responses. The very delay the Yam had once eliminated returned. Quietly at first, then openly. The Mongols had solved the problem of distance, but not permanently. Speed required constant pressure, constant discipline, and constant investment. Once those faltered, geography reasserted itself. The yam did not collapse in flames. It slowed. And in an empire built on momentum, slowing was enough. When the yam finally faded, it did not disappear because it was outdated. It disappeared because it was too demanding to sustain without absolute authority. Later empires admired it, borrowed from it, and occasionally tried to recreate it, but none matched its scale or consistency for centuries. The idea itself was revolutionary. Communication as permanent infrastructure, not an emergency measure. Speed as a governing principle, not a luxury. The Mongols understood that control depended less on how far power extended and more on how quickly it could respond. Successor states preserved fragments of the system. The Yuan dynasty in China expanded relay stations. Later postal networks in Persia and Russia echoed yam principles. Even European courier services adopted relay logic, though often without the same level of enforcement or speed. What made the yam unique was not technology. It used no inventions unknown to the medieval world. Horses, roads, stations, and authority had always existed. The difference was integration. Everything served motion. Everything existed to prevent delay. For centuries afterward, no empire could move information as quickly across such vast territory. Even as ships crossed oceans, land-based communication lagged behind Mongol standards. In many regions, speed regressed. The yam also reshaped expectations. Rulers who inherited former Mongol lands struggled with slower communication. Merchants remembered faster times. Travelers noticed the loss. Once distance had been defeated, its return felt oppressive. In the modern world of instant communication, it is tempting to dismiss the yam as primitive, but judged by its context, it was extraordinary. It compressed continents. It synchronized armies. It allowed a nomadic empire to govern sedentary civilizations without drowning in delay. The Mongols did not invent speed. They institutionalized it, and that may be their most overlooked legacy. Not conquest, not destruction, but the realization that information, when moved fast enough, becomes power in its own right. For centuries, no one ran faster. Mongol society was shaped by one brutal truth. The steppe did not care who you were. Wind, cold, drought, and distance made survival a daily negotiation, and anyone who could not contribute became a liability. This reality defined the role of women more than any law, custom, or belief system ever could. From childhood, Mongol girls were raised with the same understanding as boys. Life would be mobile, demanding, and unforgiving. They learned to ride because walking long distances was impractical. They learned to manage animals because herds were wealth, food, and security combined. They learned to pack and dismantle gears quickly because staying still too long could mean starvation or exposure. None of this was ceremonial. It was survival training. Daily life revolved around movement. Camps shifted with seasons, pasture quality, and political necessity. Women were responsible for much of the logistical backbone that made this movement possible. They milked animals, processed dairy into portable food, repaired clothing and tack, managed household goods, and coordinated labor within extended families. These tasks were not secondary to warfare, they enabled it. In a nomadic economy, production happened at home, and the home was never static. A poorly organized household could slow migration, weaken herds, and endanger everyone. As a result, competence mattered more than obedience. A woman who could keep animals healthy, food stored, and equipment functional earned respect because she kept people alive. This environment left little room for rigid gender ideals. The steppe rewarded effectiveness. Strength was measured in endurance, decisiveness, and reliability rather than physical dominance alone. Women were not excluded from responsibility because exclusion would have been inefficient. Importantly, this was not equality in the modern sense. Mongol society was still hierarchical and patriarchal in many ways, but it was pragmatic. When survival is uncertain, ideology bends, roles expand, authority follows ability. What emerged was a culture where women were expected to be capable, resilient, and decisive, not because of philosophy, but because the steppe demanded it. The empire that later terrified half the world was built on this foundation of competence. Before there were conquests, there was survival. And on the Mongolian steppe, survival was a shared responsibility. When Mongol men rode out on campaign, the empire did not pause behind them. Camps continued to move. Herds continued to grow or fail. Trade continued. And in the absence of men, women assumed full operational control. This was not symbolic authority, it was practical command. A Mongol camp was a complex system. Animals had to be grazed strategically to avoid exhausting pasture. Food had to be preserved for winter. Equipment had to be repaired. Disputes had to be settled before they escalated into violence. When men were away for months or years, women made these decisions alone. Senior women, often wives or mothers of clan leaders, coordinated labor within extended families. They assigned tasks, managed supplies, and enforced discipline. Younger women and children followed their direction, not because custom demanded it, but because survival required clear leadership. A poorly run camp could destroy the wealth of an entire family long before any enemy appeared. These women also controlled economic exchange. Mongol camps traded hides, animals, dairy products, and later captured goods with neighboring groups and settled communities. Women negotiated, set prices, and decided when and where to trade. Their judgment directly affected the wealth available to warriors in the field. Legal authority followed responsibility. Women could represent households in disputes, arrange marriages, and make binding decisions while men were absent. Their authority was recognized because ignoring it would destabilize the group. Power on the steppe was not theoretical, it was enforced by necessity. This system also created continuity. When a man returned from campaign, the camp he rejoined had been maintained, not merely preserved. Herds were intact, children were fed, resources were accounted for. Warfare was possible precisely because women ensured stability behind the lines. It is important not to romanticize this role. Responsibility came with risk. Poor decisions could mean starvation. Drought, disease, or loss of animals could ruin reputations permanently. Authority did not protect women from consequences, it exposed them to them. Yet this exposure also built respect. Competence was visible. Leadership was proven daily. A woman who managed a camp successfully earned influence that extended beyond her household. On the Mongolian steppe, leadership did not wait for permission. It emerged wherever responsibility landed. And very often, that responsibility fell to women. On the Mongolian steppe, movement was life. Distance between grazing grounds, water sources, and trade routes made walking impractical and dangerous. Riding was not a skill reserved for warriors. It was basic literacy in a nomadic world, and Mongol women learned it early. Girls rode from childhood, often before they could properly manage adult responsibilities. Horses were tools, not status symbols. Women rode to herd animals, relocate camps, visit kin, and manage trade. Balance, endurance, and confidence mattered more than elegance. Falling off a horse was embarrassing, but not catastrophic. Being unable to ride was. Physical strength was expected, not exceptional. Daily work required lifting heavy loads, restraining animals, hauling supplies, and enduring long hours outdoors in extreme weather. Women were judged less by appearance and more by reliability. The steppe rewarded those who could endure. Hunting was common, especially in times of scarcity. Women participated when necessary, providing meat and managing animals. This did not make them full-time warriors, but it did blur the rigid separation between male and female labor found in many settled societies. Skills mattered more than symbolism. Women were also responsible for defending camps when required. While large-scale warfare was conducted by men, camps could be targeted by raiders. Women knew how to respond. They could mount horses quickly, move animals to safety, and resist long enough to deter attackers or buy time. Preparedness was part of daily life. Clothing reflected function. Garments were designed for riding and work, not display. Practicality dominated fashion. Warmth, mobility, and durability mattered. Status was shown through materials and craftsmanship, not restriction of movement. This physical competence earned respect. A woman who could ride well, work hard, and endure harsh conditions was valued as a partner, leader, and contributor. Dependency was dangerous. Self-sufficiency was admired. It is tempting to frame this as empowerment in modern terms, but that misses the point. Mongol society did not celebrate strength for its own sake. It required it. The steppe was not interested in ideals. It demanded results. On horseback, hauling supplies, managing animals, and surviving long migrations, Mongol women were not exceptions to the rule. They were the rule. In Mongol society, marriage was never just personal. It was political, economic, and strategic, and women were not passive pieces in this system. They were the connective tissue that held clans, alliances, and entire power networks together. Marriages linked families across vast distances. A woman brought with her not just labor, but influence, loyalty, and access to kinship networks. Through her, information flowed. Trade routes opened. Disputes were softened or inflamed. A smart marriage could stabilize a border or prevent conflict long before armies were needed. Women maintained these alliances long after the wedding. They hosted guests, exchanged gifts, and preserved relationships through constant communication. When tensions rose between clans, women often acted as intermediaries, using kinship ties to negotiate solutions that men, bound by honor and rivalry, could not. Within families, senior women wielded significant authority. Mothers, grandmothers, and first wives held influence over household decisions, inheritance matters, and marriage arrangements for younger members. Respect for age and experience was strong. A woman who had proven herself competent over decades carried weight that could override younger male voices. Polygynous households, common among elites, did not automatically sideline women. Instead, they created internal hierarchies where senior wives managed resources and coordinated labor. These households functioned less like romantic arrangements and more like administrative units. Leadership skills mattered. Women also retained strong ties to their natal families. Marriage did not erase these bonds. In times of crisis, women could leverage connections on both sides, acting as bridges between clans. This dual belonging gave them unique leverage in negotiations. Importantly, women were not isolated from political consequences. A poorly managed alliance could bring retaliation. A successful one could elevate an entire lineage. Responsibility followed influence. Again, this was not equality in the modern sense. Men still dominated formal military leadership. But Mongol women operated in a political space that many contemporary societies denied them entirely. Their power was informal but effective. On the steppe, stability depended on relationships as much as force, and women were the architects of those relationships. While most Mongol women exercised power within camps and families, some rose far higher. When Khans died or campaigns stretched on for years, women stepped into roles that were unmistakably political. They ruled not as symbols, but as regents with real authority. The Mongol Empire experienced frequent transitions of power. A Khan's death did not always produce an immediate successor. During these interregnums, senior women, often widows of Khans, governed entire territories. They issued orders, managed diplomacy, collected tribute, and oversaw military logistics. Their authority was recognized because the empire could not afford paralysis. These women were not placeholders. They made decisions that shaped the future of the empire. They balanced rival factions, delayed or advanced elections, and ensured stability while succession was negotiated. In some cases, they ruled for years. Their legitimacy rested on experience. These women had managed camps, alliances, and resources long before stepping into imperial roles. They understood the mechanics of power from the inside. Male nobles might contest succession, but few questioned a woman's right to keep the system functioning in the meantime. Importantly, this authority was not hidden. Regents received envoys, issued commands, and enforced law. They were visible rulers. Foreign diplomats recorded their presence with surprise, often filtering their authority through their own cultural assumptions. But the Mongols themselves were not shocked. Competence mattered more than precedent. Elite women also influenced succession outcomes. By controlling timing, access, and resources, they shaped which candidates emerged strongest. Delaying a Kurultai could weaken rivals. Supporting certain factions quietly could determine the next ruler long before any formal vote. This power was not without risk. Regents walked a narrow line. Too passive, and chaos followed. Too assertive, and resistance grew. Women who ruled successfully did so by mastering balance rather than force. Once a new Khan was chosen, many regents stepped aside without conflict. Their goal had never been permanent rule. It was continuity. In a world where many societies barred women from formal authority, the Mongols accepted female rule when it worked. Not because of ideology, but because instability was worse. At the highest levels of the empire, the same rule applied as on the steppe. If you could hold things together, you were allowed to lead. Mongol women operated within a legal and religious landscape that was unusually flexible for its time. The empire did not enforce a single rigid belief system, and that openness extended into everyday life. Shamanism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and local traditions coexisted under Mongol rule. Women navigated this pluralism with practical ease. In traditional steppe belief systems, women were not excluded from the sacred. Shamanism, in particular, allowed women to serve as spiritual figures, healers, and intermediaries with the unseen world. Religious authority was based on perceived ability, not gender. A woman believed to possess spiritual power commanded respect regardless of social rank. Legally, women had recognized rights. They could own property, manage wealth, and inherit livestock. These rights were not symbolic. Herds were economic power, and controlling them meant independence. Widows often retained control of family assets rather than being absorbed into male guardianship. This legal recognition reinforced women's authority within households and camps. Marriage contracts mattered. Dowries, bride wealth, and inheritance were clearly defined. and women were active participants in these arrangements. Divorce, while not casual, was possible. A woman who returned to her natal family did not automatically lose status or protection. Her labor and connections still mattered. The Mongol legal code emphasized order and functionality. Laws existed to preserve stability, not to enforce moral conformity. As long as obligations were met and authority respected, personal belief and domestic arrangements were tolerated. This flexibility gave women space to operate without constant interference. Religious tolerance also allowed elite women to patronize multiple traditions. Some supported Buddhist institutions. Others favored Christian or Islamic scholars. This patronage gave women influence over cultural and diplomatic relationships, especially when dealing with foreign envoys who shared those beliefs. Again, this was not modern equality. Patriarchal norms still existed. Violence against women was not absent. But compared to many contemporary societies, Mongol women moved within a wider legal and spiritual field. Law and belief on the steppe served survival and cohesion. And within that framework, women were recognized not as dependents, but as participants. When outsiders encountered Mongol society, few things unsettled them more than the role of women. European, Middle Eastern, and Chinese observers arrived with expectations shaped by their own rigid gender hierarchies. What they found on the steppe did not fit comfortably into those frameworks. Travelers noted that Mongol women rode freely, spoke openly, and managed property without male supervision. They appeared in public spaces without seclusion. They negotiated. They gave orders. To many foreign writers, this behavior was interpreted as strange, improper, or even immoral. Rather than question their assumptions, they often framed Mongol women as exceptions or curiosities. Some accounts describe women who drank alcohol openly, participated in feasts, and spoke directly to men outside their families. For visitors from societies where women were tightly restricted, this was shocking. The conclusion many reached was not that Mongol society was structured differently, but that it was somehow less civilized. Others were more perceptive. A few observers recognized that Mongol women were not acting out of rebellion or novelty. They were acting out of necessity. The steppe demanded participation, not segregation. A woman who could not manage affairs in her husband's absence was a weakness, not a virtue. Elite women caused particular discomfort. Foreign envoys sometimes found themselves negotiating with female regents or influential wives. These interactions were recorded awkwardly, often minimized or explained away as temporary anomalies. Yet the decisions made in those meetings were real, binding, and enforced. This misunderstanding affected diplomacy. Some envoys underestimated female authority and paid the price. Ignoring a woman who controlled resources or access could stall negotiations or provoke retaliation. Others adapted quickly, realizing that respect mattered more than expectation. Cultural shock also ran in the opposite direction. Mongol women observed foreign societies where women were secluded, veiled, or legally dependent, and found those systems equally strange. To them, such restrictions appeared inefficient and risky. If half the population was sidelined, how did those societies function under pressure? These mutual misunderstandings shaped how the Mongols were remembered. Later histories, written largely by outsiders, often downplayed women's roles or treated them as footnotes. The reality was more complex. Mongol women were not symbols of rebellion against patriarchy. They were products of an environment that rewarded capability. Outsiders struggled to accept that difference, and many never fully did. As the Mongol Empire expanded, it began to change the very conditions that had shaped women's authority in the first place. Conquest brought wealth, cities, bureaucracy, and settled administration. These developments strengthened imperial control, but they quietly narrowed the space in which Mongol women had once operated freely. Nomadic life demanded flexibility. Settled empires demanded structure. As Mongol rulers took over China, Persia, and other urbanized regions, they inherited administrative systems built on rigid hierarchies and formal offices. These systems were overwhelmingly male. Power became something recorded, archived, and housed in buildings rather than exercised through daily competence. Elite women still held influence, but it became more confined. Regents continued to rule during successions, but long-term female authority grew harder to sustain. Bureaucrats replaced kinship networks. Written law replaced negotiation. Mobility decreased. And with it, the everyday authority women had once exercised through movement and management. Cultural assimilation played a role. Mongol elites adopted customs from conquered societies, including stricter gender norms. Court life emphasized ceremony, seclusion, and appearance over endurance and labor. Women were increasingly expected to conform to elite standards imported from sedentary cultures, not steppe pragmatism. Marriage alliances became more formalized. Political marriages still mattered, but women's influence was now filtered through court politics, rather than exercised directly within camps. Informal power became harder to wield in environments governed by protocol. This shift was gradual, not sudden. In rural areas and among nomadic groups, traditional roles persisted for generations. But at the imperial center, the tone changed. Authority became centralized, visibility decreased. Women who once commanded camps now navigated palaces. The irony is clear. The same empire that rose because of steppe pragmatism slowly eroded it. As Mongol rule stabilized, the need for constant adaptation diminished. Survival mattered less than order. And when survival stopped driving social roles, older hierarchies reasserted themselves. This was not unique to the Mongols. It is a recurring pattern in history. Mobility creates flexibility. Settlement creates constraint. By the time the Mongol world fragmented into successor states, women's roles looked more familiar to neighboring civilizations. The steppe had not disappeared, but its influence had faded. What remained was memory. And memory, unlike daily practice, is easy to overlook. When the Mongol Empire fractured and the steppe lost its central role in global power, the visibility of Mongol women faded with it. Later societies inherited the empire's borders, trade routes, and institutions, but not always the social logic that had made them work. Over time, women's authority became less obvious, then quietly erased from the story. Yet it never vanished entirely. In nomadic communities that retained mobility, women continued to manage households, control livestock, and make decisions that mattered. The steppe did not forget what had once been necessary. Even as courts grew rigid and bureaucracies expanded, everyday survival still rewarded competence over ceremony. Historical memory, however, is selective. Chroniclers focused on conquests, khans, and battles. Women appeared only when they ruled outright or disrupted expectations. The thousands who kept camps functioning, alliances stable, and economies alive rarely earned mention. Their work was too ordinary to seem important, even though empires depended on it. Modern assumptions often flatten Mongol women into symbols. Either they are portrayed as uniquely liberated, or they are dismissed as marginal. Both views miss the point. Mongol women were not exceptional because they broke rules. They were effective because the rules were shaped by necessity. The steppe created a social environment where participation mattered more than ideology. When survival is uncertain, societies cannot afford to sideline half their population. The Mongols understood this instinctively. As conditions changed, so did roles. Not because people forgot the past, but because the environment no longer demanded it. This legacy still challenges modern thinking. It reminds us that gender roles are not fixed truths. They are responses to pressure, risk, and resources. Change the environment, and social structures change with it. Mongol women did not set out to redefine society. They simply did what had to be done, and for a time, that was enough to help build the largest land empire in history. Their story is not one of ideology or rebellion. It is one of adaptation. And adaptation, more than conquest, is what made the Mongol world work